The last issue I want to deal with, and this is really dealt with in the readings by Mike Davis, is on urbanization. And as we can see here, right, this is kind of what Davis is getting at, this kind of cheek by jowl kind of existence that has come into being in the modern period, by which you can see the modernity in the distance, the office towers and the condos and the great apartments of Mumbai, India, but existing side by side with kind of shanty towns, slums, whatever else you want to call them. Okay. And largely, in many ways, some things have never changed. Cities have always been the place where inequality is most pronounced. And so that necessarily hasn't changed over the last few centuries. Is it getting worse? Some people claim yes. Okay. So we look at urbanization. So, again, going back to the things I talked about earlier, right? Very few people lived in what we would call cities or towns until around 1900. And again, thinking about that global rise of population, many of them are moving to cities. Cities are the kind of drivers of the modern industrial capitalist world, right? But this is, again, mostly a modern phenomenon, and mostly a modern phenomenon, as we'll see in a minute when we talk about Baron von Haussmann in Paris, being driven by systems of public health and sewers and all kinds of other things that make it possible to live in cities, right? Because, again, cities had also been centers of disease and ill health. And so this was one of the reasons why people like Thomas Jefferson in the United States wanted to create kind of a farmers' republic, right? Because he looked overseas to Europe and Britain and saw, essentially poverty and ill health and all those other kinds of things, and said, we can't build a healthy democracy looking like that. Okay. Again, some of this is taken up by what we may want to think of as mega cities here, right? And you can look at those charts there in terms of, where those cities are located, both in the past and down to today, and how some of these cities have grown by huge leaps and bounds. I mean, Tokyo is at least 35 million. Some people claim it's 40 million people. Many of those, and if we look at the numbers of the populations with 10 million or more, most of them are located in the global south, in developing nations, and then may explain that kind of cheek by jowl kind of existence that Davis speaks of, and that previous picture showed. Okay, so again, certainly growing over this period. And largely, again, a 20th century phenomenon. And again, will this continue? Yes. And you look at, most of the world will be urban. And again, what does this mean for social, political, economic issues within and between societies? We may want to think about the rural-urban divide in things like Canadian and American politics. The difference between is not so much, again, perhaps between blue states and red states in the United States, but between blue cities and red countryside. Okay, so these have tremendous impacts. Okay, cities have always been the symbol in many ways of modernity, right? And we can think about this, in terms of one of the great, early films by Fritz Lang, it's Metropolis, right? The cities were going to be the growth poles of this modern capitalist economy, where industrialization, economic development, and transformation and innovation largely occur, right? We think of cities as kind of hustling and bustling, and centers where, culture and, universities and all of those other kinds of things are located. Right, and they're kind of going to drive forward modern societies. But as I noted earlier, right, again, they're also places where historically inequality has been most present. Now, the functions of cities, both in national and global economies, have changed over time. Some were administrative, like we think of London or Paris or capital cities, or Ottawa or Toronto, right? Some of them were mercantile, right? So keyed into trade. And again, some of those corresponded. Any kind of port city was going to be tied into trade. So London, Liverpool, Montreal, again, New York, Los Angeles, others, okay, in that regard. Others are industrial, right? And we think of, again, going back to the first lecture, thinking of Chicago as a center for the production of farm implements and the production of meat, and that would feed a good chunk of the American and global populations. And then financial, and we think of, New York and Wall Street, or Frankfurt, or London, or Toronto, again, the sort of centers of global finance. And some of those cities obviously occupy a lot of those different realms, not just one or the other. But, where cities sit in that means that, they can kind of rise and fall. And again, if we think about, Detroit as an example, it is, it's an industrial city. It's Motor City. It produces all the cars that become, again, a symbol of modernity in the United States and elsewhere. The great assembly lines that were turning out Chevys and Fords and Chryslers. And in 1950, Detroit was the 5th largest city in the United States at 1.8 million people. It was, again, because of the height of its age of the assembly line, right? Presently, Detroit has, a population is less than half, 670,000, the 24th largest city in the United States. And that's largely because of the deindustrialization, right? The downsizing of the auto industry and the growth of automation and all kinds of other things like that. Fewer and fewer auto workers are needed to pump out cars. Some of that production has shifted off seas. Some of that production has shifted to other areas of the United States where wage and labor rights are lower, right? And so in 2013, Detroit filed for bankruptcy. And parts of the city have essentially returned to nature. Many of those factories sit crumbling and are just simply unoccupied. And that means not only those factories, but nearby houses and shopping malls and all kinds of other things have basically collapsed. Now, will Detroit rebound? Some people are claiming yes, but again, cities can rise and fall. Like I said before, the other thing to think about is cities we think about also, particularly in the modern period, and again, mostly in, developed nations, Europe, the Americas, we think of them as kind of set out on grids and planned and all of those other kinds of things. But before the 1850s, kind of cities grew by, much in the same way they might be growing in places in Africa and Asia. And that was kind of just, they just expand, they just mushroom, and they grow the way they grow. But as we know, that has tremendous implications for the health of the residents. And so, this really doesn't change until someone like Baron von Haussmann comes along to Paris in the 1850s and kind of solves the problem of the city, right? Which is basically, how do we bring all of these people together and not create a situation by which you're going to have crowd diseases, not create the situation by things like cholera and typhus, which are largely waterborne, are going to be transferred, and they're going to limit the size and function of cities. And so Haussmann really thinks about Paris, and he's most famous for the creation of the Paris sewer systems, as well as the great boulevards. But that's going to be the biggest issue, right? And we can see that in terms of what we talked about in the first lecture about public health issues, and public health being so important to the success and viability of populations. And this is most true, right, in cities. But he also thought about this in terms of flow of not just water, but traffic, people, and obviously capital and money, right? And so if all of this flowed more freely, then these cities could grow and the economies could grow and all of those other kinds of things. And so Paris becomes that, but certainly the right bank. And if we think about, if you've been to Paris, the difference between the right bank and the left bank, right? The right bank is where all of those grand boulevards are, the Champs-Élysées and all the rest of that. And it looks, ordered and as we see here, kind of uniform. The left bank, less so, right? The old Paris, the old city of Paris that was largely left. Looks a little bit, more like the picture on the left. And so von Haussmann transforms Paris largely in the space of less than 20 years. And his ideas then become central to the growth of urbanization, the ideas about urban planning throughout the latter part of the 19th and 20th century, right? And so we think about the development of freeways and against sewer systems and all of those kinds of basic infrastructure for cities. Cities require tremendous infrastructure to move people, goods, and to maintain their the health of their population. But in doing so, like, what happened to those people, right? All of those buildings that were cut down and rebuilt, largely people did not move back into them. And where were they displaced to? And so this has been one of the issues around what we might want to call slum clearance or slum renewal or urban renewal, is that many of those populations were often displaced to the suburbs, which we'll talk about in a minute, where the conditions in which they lived did not necessarily improve. And in many cases, they became more marginalized, not less marginalized. Okay. The other element we think about here as well, and one last thing I want to talk about is, you can see the picture there of the Bois de Boulogne, right? The creation of urban park systems becomes central, because again, the notion here that cities needed places of respite for the population, where they could get back to nature, where they could escape the miasmas and smoke and pollution and all of those other kinds of things that were still very much unhealthy. Okay. So again, suburbs, we think again as largely a modern phenomenon, particularly if we're thinking about that picture down there in the United States. We think of them as kind of, planned and ordered and, largely the same and largely occupied by people of the same race and socioeconomic classes. And this is true in certain parts of the world, but in others, not necessarily so. And certainly, again, over the 20th century, and certainly since 1950, the ways in which central cities, as you can see from the little map on the left here, have begun occupied by office towers and condominiums and all of those other kinds of things, administrative buildings. As well as kind of what we might want to call sort of gentrified enclaves of largely those people who are working in those financial and administrative centers, right? Try and find a house in Toronto in the central city under $1.5 million. You can't. Same thing with Vancouver, right? And it doesn't matter what the house looks like, right? It's even how small it is or the state it's in. It's simply that real estate is valued. Now, central cities had tended, right, from Paris and from London and all of those other kinds of things, they tended to be concentrations of the poor. But in the modern period, as we can see from many of these pictures here, from Paris to Mumbai, they're now centers, and we could even include Toronto in this. They are now centers where immigrants arrive to, where people who are more socially, economically marginalized live. Now, not entirely. Again, the diagram shows on the left there that there are some parts of these edge cities, and again, we think about the Toronto area, that there are certain areas which are, much more wealthy. And maybe look a little bit more like the USA suburban picture than they do Clichy-sous-Bois or Mumbai, certainly. But those are areas where greater inequality, and we can see this certainly in the recent past in places like Toronto. And think about where COVID had some of the most devastating impacts on the population. Northern Etobicoke, Northern Scarborough, which again have now become immigrant receiving zones, areas where you're more likely to see, apartments that you can see in Clichy-sous-Bois, where people who are more economically and socially and politically marginalized live. Okay, so again, the structures of inequality are changing over time, right? Central cities used to be home of the poor and recent immigrants, and now it's almost the other way around. And this is happening again more and more across the world. Okay. And so I'm not going to deal a lot with this last slide here, but the share of the urban population in urban slums is going to have an impact, and it's going to have an impact in particular areas of the globe. And how is that necessarily going to cause all kinds of health problems, but also social and economic conflict and a whole range. And so again, when we think about Africa and the growth of Africa, which is portended to occur into the 21st century, where is that going to occur? And looking at this map, right, it's potentially going to cause a whole range of problems in Africa and potentially for the rest of the world. Okay, thanks very much, and we'll see you in the seminars.